Good evening. We're following major developments in the Middle East tonight, where military tensions continue to escalate and diplomatic efforts face significant obstacles. We'll break down what's happening on the ground, what regional leaders are demanding, and what the international community is saying about a conflict that's spiraling out of control. Iraqi authorities are reporting that a U.S. military airstrike on a military site in Anbar province has killed 7 soldiers and wounded 13 others. The strike marks another instance of direct military action in the region, as tensions remain high. Iraqi officials haven't released additional details about the specific target or the circumstances that led to the operation. The incident underscores the complex military dynamics at play, where U.S. forces maintain a significant presence in Iraq, ostensibly to combat extremist groups, but operations increasingly intersect with broader regional tensions. This strike comes amid a period of heightened military activity throughout the Gulf. The deaths add to growing concerns about civilian and military casualties in the region. Iraqi government officials have yet to issue a formal statement regarding potential diplomatic consequences, or whether this will affect U.S.-Iraq military cooperation agreements. The incident highlights how quickly military operations can escalate in an already volatile environment, where multiple armed forces operate in close proximity. The United States is significantly increasing its military footprint around Iran, and intelligence analysts say this shift suggests a potential move beyond air campaigns toward ground operations. The buildup includes additional troops, naval assets, and support personnel being deployed to the region. Military strategists note that this kind of expansion typically indicates preparation for more sustained or intensive operations than what airstrikes alone would require. The deployment represents a notable escalation in U.S. military posture and signals to regional actors that Washington is preparing for multiple contingencies. Defense officials have characterized the movements as defensive measures, though the scale and scope of the deployment have raised concerns among regional governments and international observers. The troop movements include personnel from various military branches and support units, suggesting comprehensive operational planning. This expansion comes as diplomatic channels remain strained and military incidents continue to occur. Analysts are watching closely to see whether this represents a temporary surge or a longer-term repositioning of American military assets in one of the world's most strategically important regions. Israeli officials have been actively working to build international support for military operations by emphasizing Iran's potential threat to European cities and interests. The strategy involved presenting Iran as a regional threat with global implications, not just a Middle Eastern concern. Israeli representatives have been engaging with European governments and media to frame the conflict in terms that resonate with Western audiences and policymakers. This diplomatic messaging campaign seeks to broaden the coalition of nations, viewing Iran as a destabilizing force. By highlighting threats to European security and economic interests, Israeli officials hope to secure tacit or explicit support from Western nations. The approach reflects a broader effort to internationalize what many view as a regional conflict. European governments have expressed concern about the rhetoric and the potential for escalation, though some have acknowledged legitimate security concerns. The messaging campaign demonstrates how military conflicts in the Middle East increasingly involve sophisticated public diplomacy efforts aimed at shaping international opinion and securing support from distant powers. Iran's military strategy and the U.S.-Israeli response have triggered significant global economic shocks that are reverberating far beyond the Middle East. Oil markets have experienced volatility as investors worry about potential disruptions to energy supplies. The uncertainty is affecting shipping routes, insurance costs, and broader economic confidence. Analysts say Iran's strategy appears focused on maintaining deterrence capabilities while avoiding direct confrontation that could trigger overwhelming military response. However, the tit-for-tat nature of recent military exchanges has created a dangerous cycle where miscalculation becomes increasingly likely. The economic impacts include rising energy prices, disrupted supply chains, and capital flight from the region. Global markets are pricing in the risk of further escalation, which could have serious consequences for economies worldwide. Financial institutions are reassessing their exposure to the region and adjusting investment strategies accordingly. The economic dimension of this conflict is becoming as significant as the military dimension, affecting everything from inflation to employment in countries far removed from the Middle East. United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres has issued a stark warning that the conflict in the Middle East has become out of control and that it's high time for it to end. Guterres' language represents an unusually direct criticism from a UN leader who typically maintains diplomatic neutrality. The Secretary-General is calling for immediate de-escalation and a return to diplomatic negotiations. His statement reflects growing international alarm about the trajectory of the conflict and the risk of further regional expansion. The UN chief has emphasized that continued military operations risk drawing in additional actors and creating humanitarian catastrophes. Guterres has called on all parties to exercise restraint and return to the negotiating table. The statement carries significant weight, given the UN's role as a forum for international diplomacy. However, the Secretary-General's appeals come at a moment when military momentum appears to be driving decisions more than diplomatic considerations. International observers note that UN calls for peace have had limited impact on the ground, where military commanders and political leaders continue to pursue confrontational strategies. Iran's state television has outlined 5 specific conditions that the country says must be met before it will agree to end hostilities. The demands represent Iran's opening position in any potential negotiations and signal what Tehran views as non-negotiable requirements. While the specific conditions haven't been fully detailed in all reporting, they're expected to include security guarantees, recognition of Iranian interests, and potentially compensation for damages. The announcement suggests that Iran is at least theoretically open to negotiated settlement, though the conditions may be difficult for other parties to accept. Setting preconditions is a standard negotiating tactic, but it also can harden positions and make compromise more difficult. International mediators will need to assess whether these conditions provide a basis for negotiation or represent a hardline stance designed for domestic consumption. The fact that Iran is articulating conditions publicly suggests some level of internal debate about the path forward. Whether these demands can serve as a foundation for serious negotiations remains unclear, but they do provide a framework that diplomats can work with in any future talks. Human rights organizations are accusing Israel of expanding what they characterize as ethnic cleansing operations in East Jerusalem, with reports of Palestinian families being forcibly displaced from their homes. The rights groups say Israeli authorities are throwing families into the streets and that the pace and scale of these operations have increased. The displacement campaigns target Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, an area whose status remains contested under international law. Rights advocates argue these actions violate international humanitarian law and constitute war crimes. Israeli officials maintain that the operations target illegal structures and that they're enforcing property and zoning laws. However, human rights monitors say the enforcement is selective and disproportionately targets Palestinian residents, while Jewish settlers face different treatment. The displacement of civilians during armed conflict raises serious legal and moral questions. International observers have documented the pattern of displacement and called for investigations. The situation in East Jerusalem represents a separate but related dimension of the broader conflict, where military operations intersect with settlement expansion and demographic changes. Activists associated with Palestine Action who were imprisoned in the United Kingdom are planning to sue British prisons over allegations of mistreatment during their detention. The activists claim they experienced conditions that violated their rights and that prison authorities subjected them to inappropriate treatment. The planned legal action represents an effort to hold institutions accountable for what the activists characterize as punitive measures. The case highlights how the Middle East conflict extends into legal and political battles in Western countries. British civil rights organizations have expressed concern about the allegations and are supporting the activists' efforts to pursue legal remedies. Prison authorities have defended their handling of the detainees, saying they followed standard procedures. The case will likely involve questions about how Western countries balance security concerns with the rights of political activists. The outcome could have implications for how prisons handle detainees involved in political activism related to international conflicts. The legal proceedings are expected to draw attention to broader questions about protest rights and state response to activism. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem has declared that negotiating with Israel while under military fire amounts to imposing surrender on Lebanon, and that the organization will not pursue talks under such circumstances. Qassem's statement reflects Hezbollah's position that any negotiations must occur from a position of strength, not weakness. The Hezbollah chief has called for regional unity among various armed groups and political factions. His remarks suggest that Hezbollah views the current military situation as one where negotiations would disadvantage Lebanon and Palestinian interests. The statement also indicates that Hezbollah is preparing for a prolonged conflict rather than seeking quick resolution. Regional analysts note that Qassem's hardline rhetoric may reflect internal pressure from more militant factions within the organization. Lebanon's government faces a difficult position, caught between Hezbollah's military operations and international pressure to restrain the group. The refusal to negotiate while under fire effectively closes off diplomatic channels at a moment when de-escalation might be possible. Qassem's statement underscores how military dynamics on the ground are shaping political calculations and making compromise increasingly difficult for all parties involved. Tonight, we've covered a conflict that's expanding militarily, hardening diplomatically, and creating ripple effects across the global economy. From military buildups and airstrikes to displaced families and international calls for peace, the situation in the Middle East demands urgent attention. We'll continue following these developments as they unfold